Walt here. Today's video lecture, we're going to be looking at audience analysis, chapter 4. So, nice quote from Alfred North Whitehead, both a scientist and a philosopher. A man really writes for an audience of about 10 persons. Of course, if others like it, that's a clear gain. But if those 10 are satisfied, he's content. And when we talk about audience analysis, trying to figure out who those 10 persons are, it's a big part of what we're going to try and aim for. Now, here's my own quote. Estimating your audience is not just a chapter in the story of successful writing. It's the first twist that transforms simple words into resonating messages, turning readers into active participants in your story and having them help you reach your objectives. When we talk about story in the upcoming chapters, right, you'll see that the audience plays a critical role. And so before you can really craft your story, before you can start trying to hit your tactical objectives with your writing, you really have to understand who your audience is. Right? So the audience is a critical part of our target when we're talking about using TWIST to get our tactical writing. So let's start with a basic question. Who is your audience? What do we mean by that? So we're going to start with, well, anyone who reads your writing is your audience, but who do you want to be in your audience, and what do you want to know about them? Why are they reading? What is their objective? Again, it's their objective. Tactical writing, you have your objective, but any reader has their objective. And so part of understanding your audience is trying to figure out what their objective is. And so we can ask ourselves some questions. Are they reading for knowledge? I'm doing a textbook, for example, they're reading for knowledge, or at least reading because it's required for them to demonstrate their knowledge. Are they reading to understand an assignment? When I write my homework assignments, for example, I have been intentionally making them a little bit more complex than many students are used to. I don't tell them exactly what to do because they have to transition to what's going to happen in the real world where bosses rarely give very detailed assignments of do exactly this or that. If they are, then you're an automaton and you'll be replaced by ChatGPT or something else because somebody can specify exactly what you need to do. They're not looking for you to have a deep understanding. So if they're reading to understand, then you want to write so that they can have that understanding. In my case, I write to make them have a deeper understanding and think about how to read and write, how to understand what an assignment is because they have to get better and better at that. For many things like proposals, reviewers are reading to choose between competing ideas to meet their organizational objectives. So they're reading to find what they're interested in. They may not care about everything all the knowledge you choose to impart. They may not be trying to understand everything you're doing. They're trying to figure out, are these ideas are going to meet my objectives? If they're reviewing for publication, then they're looking to sort of see their personal views. What do they think about the work? Analyzing it in terms of is it good or not, in terms of what their personal views about that are. But they also want to look at the views of the publication's expected audience. Is this what my audience would do? So as a reviewer, I have both of those roles when I'm reading. I'm reading the content for correctness, but I'm also looking to see, is this something that would be of interest to the audience? If they're, when I'm reading as a manager or for my employees, I'm reading to assess if you or your team has done the specified work. When I'm grading homework, it's the same way. I'm reading to assess what you've done. And we'll talk a little bit about some of these in just a second. I want to get through all the lists. And then there's people who are reading for pleasure. And I put this one in italics because for lots of writing, that's the audience you're going for, the general audience, people who are reading for pleasure. They don't have a particular need. That's really not the goal of tactical writing. Tactical writing almost always have one of a kind of objectives above. There's a few others that could be in there, but they're reading for something that's about them, right, and what their job is and what they're trying to do. And so when you go to look at this, you have to start estimating not just who your audience is, but why are they doing, what's going on. And that will be a really important thing of understanding what the audience is. So we have to ask ourselves a question for the audience analysis. First, there's a basic question. What's their level of reading skills do they possess, right? And you sometimes want to aim a little bit lower than you might think. Aiming for 12th grade, if you're talking about an adult audience, might be okay if they've gone to college. But if you don't think they've been going to college, then probably aim for 10th grade. And obviously, if you're aiming for teenagers and tweens, you'd be shooting even lower. And there's lots of tools that can actually help you analyze and estimate your reading skill. You really don't want to write for too high a level because then your audience will not, there's some issues about the style that will show up, but also about the verb. The terminology they know. What do they know? What do they not know, right? Understanding their banks of knowledge, which we'll again talk about when we get to storytelling. This is really important because it's about, if you're talking about what they know, then you're asking what's up here, because you're going to have to relate whatever you're trying to talk about to what they have up there. And if they don't know something, then you're going to have to introduce it and explain it and talk about that in the story to relate to what you need them to know. So have to have some ideas of what those things are going to be. What motivates them? Are they interested in facts? Are they interested in emotions? We'll get to some of that later in this lecture. What do they believe? Changing someone's beliefs is much harder than changing what they know. It is easy to give someone knowledge. It is hard to challenge their beliefs. If they have a strongly held belief, it is very difficult for any story, for any writing, to quickly change it. So if you have to change that, then you have to really think hard about the way you're going to reach what that belief is and how you're going to relate it. On the other hand, if they firmly believe something and they have a lot of knowledge about it, then you're going to be able to exploit that knowledge and that belief in terms of making your arguments. So understanding where they are on that is important. How do they behave? Behavior is even harder sometimes to change than belief. Sometimes it's easier. But most of the time, if you're trying to influence somebody's behavior, you want to have some idea how they do behave. And very often with behaviors, you have to think about what is their thought process? How do they just make decisions? Are they emotionally driven? Are they impulsive? Are they thorough, gather all the data, analyze and make decision types? Those different things will affect how they're going to use what you're writing. And again, writing in tactical sense is almost always about you writing for your objectives, but they're reading for their objectives. And so how are they going to go through that? How much time and effort will they put in the reading? If they're super busy and this is not on their critical list, you might have to make sure that you get across what you want in the first 3 or 4 sentences. Otherwise, they're not going to keep reading. So you got to figure out that aspect of who they are. And that could actually change by the time of day of week. So emails on Monday morning tend to get rushed through because over the weekend they collected a lot more of them than if they get an email to read on a Wednesday afternoon. That's not a busy day for them. So you got to figure out who's your audience, what's the time constraints on your audience when you get to that. And then what we talked about their thought process they use, but what's the organizational structure, the organization structure that's used for decisions? Maybe they're not even the decision maker. If they have to understand your writing so that they can make an argument to someone else, then you need a different level of writing and audience analysis because you have to have a story they can retell and remember everything, as opposed to a story that just gets them to reach a decision. And we're going to have to see where that goes. So you want to think about what that's going to look like. So a common technique across lots of different tactical applications of writing is what's called a persona model. We talk about these in entrepreneurship because you're trying to think about what your customer will look like, but they're also used in user interface and UX design for trying to design web stuff. They're designed for I use them for rating because I'm trying to think about who am I writing to, and we'll get through some examples as we go through this. So a persona model is really a semi-fictitious representation of your ideal audience based on real data and insights. And we'll talk about how to gather some data as we go through this lecture. And so I actually think of it as persona models because a real audience might have multiple people, but I can think of it. And sometimes I even give them names, and we'll go through some examples. We go through some of this. But so the data sources we're going to look at ways of incorporating demographics, psychographics, behavioral data to create a holistic view of your target audience members. And we put that together, we're going to be able to have a much better understanding of these are the kinds of people I'm trying to reach and what they do. I notice there we have some basic data about them, demographics, psychographics, how they think, how they do things, and behavioral data, how they behave. All of those are important because they all affect different aspects of what we need to accomplish with our tactical writing. What is their purpose? This goes back to the previous slide, right? This aids in making sure you're sending the right message, but you want to understand their challenges and the pain points of your audience so that you can tailor the message and strategy and story so that you can actually reach them. So you got to think of what are they trying to do. We want to think about some of the components that go into aspects that might be more directly observable than really trying to get inside their head. We'll talk about some of that as well. But what is their age? What is their expected age, occupation? What are their interests, both inside and outside of the job? What are their pain points, goals, and preferred communications? So these are the kinds of things we're going to want to actually capture. So the data sources and purpose said sort of things we're interested in, but we want to capture some of that. We'll go through 2 examples in a second. And then behavioral personas really are primarily describe audiences in terms rather than just their demographics. Instead of saying these are men between the age of 40 and 50, that's a demographic trait. Sometimes we might describe it as these are men whose jobs are primarily to acquire technology for the military, right? They could have a whole range of ages. They could have a whole range of skills. They could have different genders, but they have their behaviors are people who are analyzing things for a reason. They might be behavioral things might be people who are particularly interested in, and they're active in trying to solve a sustainability problem or something along those. That's when you're looking at what's driving them and how they behave. So in this context, a persona represents a group of customers rather than a single entity with a similar way of thinking and behavior related to a specific service. So behavioral personas are often by design a group of people, but you might still represent them by a single person that is sort of your typical, your archetype for that model. So one way people build persona models is something called an empathy map, and you might have seen this depending on what version of Innovation 1010 you did. But this is where you look at some things overall, where you look, okay, we start on the left here, like how are users' feelings about the experience? What really matters to them in terms of feelings? What are the tasks they're trying to do? But you have to empathize with their feelings and understand how that's going to impact them as they work on the task. What other things are influencing them? What other people, things, places might influence how they act? So if they're active on social media, then social media influencers might be part of what they're dealing with. What are their pain points? What are the negative pain points? A particular subset of feelings, but they're the things that they hope to overcome. These are the problems they want to make go away. You can actually talk about their gain points. What are their positive feelings? I should put this on the slide. So there should be pain points and gain points. We talk about that very often in entrepreneurship. And so by looking at this, you sort of make this little circle with some lines on it, and you can sort of say, okay, here's the overall aspects of the person. Another far more detailed kind of persona is often used when you're looking at especially user interface design. So this one is from a government development effort for websites. So if I'm looking at my customer being a healthcare professional, I can gather some very basic demographics. What is their expected age? What is their occupation, their employer, their education level, and their income? All of these demographics can influence how somebody is expected to read messages when you're writing to them. Then you can add some background information. What is their primary goal? What kind of devices do they talk to? How tech savvy are they? This is important for especially website stuff. What are their frustrations and challenges? What's the reason for visiting this particular website? And then you can talk about the kinds of features that motivate them with respect to website features. And these are various ways of organizations building persona. Now you might be wondering, why would I go through all the detail of making a page that looks like this that describes these people? And the answer is, when you're working in a team and you have to explain a lot of your choices and a lot of your decision-making processes up the hierarchy before it's blessed and you're allowed to go work on it, then you want to have a story you can tell. So you're writing a story about the people you're writing your final story for, so that you can convince people of the direction you're going to go. So you're going to use this as part of your design effort, but then you're also going to use it to communicate why you made those design decisions to other people. If you're really writing in a small team of one or two, you wouldn't go through this. You'd go with a much simpler empathy map, or just a simple set of a couple of bullet points that convey this. But if you're pitching to investors, or if you're pitching to management, you want some of this detailed and written down so you can tell them the story. In fact, we often put names like Alicia is on here, so you can tell the story. Is Alicia a real person, or are they made up? Well, we'll see. That depends on where you got the data from. But this is an important part of the process. Is you're often building your persona so you can tell their story about why you're writing your story for your tactical objective in a particular way. So one last thing before I get into actually doing audience analysis, I want to put this, because this really comes across everything. You want to brainstorm. Audience analysis is always a biased estimate. Even if you're writing for one person, your boss at work, or an employee that works for you, right? It's always a biased estimate because you don't really know enough about them to know everything. So it's a biased estimate because it's biased by you. One of the best ways to resolve biases is to get multiple sources of information, and hopefully some of that bias will cancel each other out. So you get much better results if your team sort of first independently makes estimates and then get together and brainstorm your final estimate. Again, good brainstorming process is a little bit of independent work on the problem and then brainstorming to come together and make it work. But this is also important in team tactical writing because, like agreeing on objectives, having a team agree on the audience model improves the tactical writing for the whole team. Otherwise, different people tend to write what they think the audience will be, and if they disagree on what the audience is, then the writing has, again, an inconsistent voice because one person is writing for somebody who's like your mom, and somebody else is writing for somebody who's like your Uncle Joe, and somebody else is writing for Aunt Louise. And all of a sudden, it sounds like you're talking to different people. Sometimes that's intentional, and it can easily be made to work if you present it the right way. But if it just happens and there's no connection or no rationale for it, people will be unhappy in terms of the overall writing. So the techniques of brainstorming, this is sort of general again across all of this. This really applies to any of the techniques we will discuss. But it's more important when there is less objective data for analysis. The more hard data you have, the easier it is to have a strong estimate. But when it's just your subjective opinion, you really want to go out and get a couple other people involved in what's going to happen. And one of the ways of doing that is to sort of talk about what you've what your estimate is, your personas when you get done. But there's other ways of having those conversations as well. Okay, so now let's jump into 10 techniques for audience analysis. Okay, so this is the list. I'm going to actually talk a little bit about each of these. So I'm not going to go read this entire slide, but there's probably more, but these are 10. And some of these I use way more than others, but I want to talk about all of them because they are widely used for pretty much all of these. So the first is audience interviews and persona models. And really, this is commonly used, especially in larger corporations, as a way of building what is it, their audience, right? So you basically want to identify key stakeholders or audience members. And I want to come back to that word stakeholders because it's plural, and some of the stakeholders are not the people you're writing for. Your management are some of your stakeholders. Your partners, if you're doing a joint effort, are part of your stakeholders. They may not be the intended audience of whom you're writing. Anytime you're a consultant working with a company, you have both the company you're working for as a stakeholder, but if you're developing content for them to use with their customers, then you have two very different stakeholders, and you're going to have to identify each of those. And so when I say persona models, I might have a model for management that's making a decision and a very different model for the customer who's going to see the copyright marketing material, or for a proposal, my key stakeholders might include my partners. What's the message that each of them are going to get as they're reading this, but also who's the reviewer who's going to see this. If I'm writing a technical proposal, my stakeholders would be my co-authors, but they would also maybe be the reviewer who's either an audience member or the final audience. The final audience, the readers of the paper, are the final audience, and you can view the reviewer as someone in the middle. And sometimes there can even be an editor where I'm saying things to the editor that are different than what's actually in the paper because I'm writing a cover letter. Again, applying for jobs would be another category. So you got to, if you're going to do audience interviews, you want to have develop a set of targeted interview questions that are trying to get at what's going on. You want to conduct these interviews either in person or virtually, and very often these are sort of focus groups where they have some set of interview questions, but many of these questions are extremely open-ended. Because what they really want to do is you want to get the customers to talk about things. So you have a question that lets them talk. And that means it's not simple data to deal with. You actually have to record and transcribe the interviews for analysis. And then humans generally have to go through that interview and decide what are the things they can create from that. Sometimes they're very analytic things. Somebody might say, what was their salary or their salary range? What was their age? Now you're getting demographics about them. But other things might be how they felt about the stuff, and so how they make decisions. All of that goes into analyzing to create some audience persona. And then you might actually validate some of that persona through additional research by having follow-up questionnaires or surveys, some of the next things we're going to do. Or it might be that you validate it by actually watching their behaviors. This is a common feedback cycle, which we'll talk about as almost a separate process. But getting audience interviews, as you can imagine, is pretty intensive and expensive. But if you're a large corporation spending lots of money on marketing, this would be a path you go. If you're doing proposals or writing a paper for science, you really can't ask the end audience many questions. But you might be able to talk to partners, so it depends on where your key stakeholders are. So I consider stakeholders to be part of the audience, but I'm trying to make sure we separate that out so you can sort of see the difference. Another way, which often allows you to get larger amounts of data, is have an audience survey. So again, you define your objectives and goal for the survey. You create a questionnaire with various types of questions. Even for surveys, I still believe in having more open-ended questions that require a little bit of analysis. You can have some, like the demographic stuff, you can clearly have pull-down menu kinds of stuff. But you want to have some of the questions, allow them to tell you things. If nothing else, every survey you ever do should end with a question: what question that I didn't ask should I have asked in this survey, right? And let them tell you something about whatever you're asking about, because they might have some great insights for that. More effort to analyze it, but it's almost always worth the effort to go through that. Also, make sure you administer your survey through multiple channels. Don't just have one email list, right? You want to think about, if you have a broad enough audience, you're trying to reach everyone who could be in your audience. Don't limit to everyone you think is your audience, because again, if you're reaching, again, from a marketing point of view, you want to go pretty broad. You really want to try and ensure anonymity to encourage honest responses. You want to analyze survey data through statistical methods and sort of analyzing for large enough samples, you can get some pretty strong conclusions out of what's going on versus what's random chance. If I do a survey and I get 5 respondents, it's really hard to draw a conclusion because I have just 5 things. If I get 20, I'm starting to get towards the level of having that. And then based on that, you want to make smart objectives based on your survey insights. So now my objectives, this is my objectives of reaching my readers and what's going on. So using those surveys can be part of my objective setting very early in the process, and then I might revise it later when I get there to figure out what's going on. And so part of that is, if I want to talk about my audience survey, I should have had objectives to begin with. What's my expected response rate? What's going on before I made my survey? And then based on my responses, I can make some changes. Now, you might actually notice that I actually used this technique this semester. You all got an anonymous survey at the beginning of the semester to help me shape the style and way I'm writing this semester, trying to decide even if I should be writing, which the answer was significantly in favor, that people found a book plus the videos they expected it would be useful. So especially if it's low cost, then I'm going to go ahead and do it. But also in terms of my writing style, right, you seem to like, there was a much greater preponderance of the students who felt the short bulleted style is better than long paragraphs, which I've been trying to work through in the writing. There was also a very strong support for the need for figures, which I'm working to add. That there's a little bit slower. They take a lot of time to do, and I haven't gotten through all of them. But then there were things like the questions at the end of the chapter. Most people did not seem to find that important, so I'm not spending a lot of time on those. Setting the objectives for the chapter. A few students found that highly relevant, and then many students found it completely irrelevant. So I'm still struggling with that one because it was so split, but in the sense that a textbook could have a multitude of different learning styles, I will probably go back and add them, but because again, they take time, I haven't actually added them all in for right now. But that's the kind of thing I try and do with audience analysis, and one example of where I used it. From a company point of view, especially if you're just starting, or you're doing a business pitch, you don't have a big audience, but you can figure out who your competitors are, and then you can analyze their audience. So you can identify key competitors in wherever your niche is. You can go out and analyze their audience using any of the techniques we've talked about here in channels, and use that as your audience model. You can evaluate the effectiveness of their messaging and positioning. So now you actually get to go a little bit deeper than asking what if. You get to ask, what did you think about something that's already out there? So they have messaging and positioning. You can even see how some of their models affected their sales or whatever else, right? So this past year, there have been some very negative competitors' impacts where certain advertising messages did not resonate well with a large segment of the population and caused companies like Bud Light to have significant losses because of the way their messaging positioning, right? So if you are entering a market, you might use that as a way of deciding, do I want to follow that messaging model or not? Depends on what side of the fence you wanted to be on and how big an audience you're looking at and what fractions those are. But as you do this for your competitors, you can extract an audience persona model. But then you also have to make sure, because you're probably trying not to, you're not just competing, with the competitors. You want to have your business. You want to identify the gaps and opportunities that they're not addressing, either in their product, which is a part of what you're doing, in which case you're going to have to figure out how you're going to adapt your marketing strategy or your messaging strategy to gain a competitive edge and point out the differences that you think you have. even if they're similar in some dimension, but they're not talking about it, that might be part of your audience analysis. Like there's a gap in talking to this. But you might actually be able to build on their understanding. Right? So we talked about what does your audience know. So using a simile with respect to that will be a common thing. We're like Google, but no, that's not, never use Google. Sorry, I should have never said that, right? We're like the Gap, but we have stylish clothes, right? Implying they don't, but something that helps your audience understand what you're trying to accomplish in a very short sentence or two, as through a simile, is one way of using your competitor audience analysis. You can also, for many of the techniques I'll talk about next, you'll actually be able to also do them from your competitor's point of view and understand what's going on. Okay. So contextual analysis is important for many types of things, especially because understanding the environmental factors that affect your audience. Again, if you're going back to the sort of empathy model, if you can empathize with your audience and then understand how does that environment change, right? So especially for nonprofits, environmental factors can include like, who's my competition? If you're trying to talk about raising money locally and there's a major disaster someplace, you're now competing for dollars, and you have to be careful how you position it because you have to think about how that will impact your audience. And we'll talk about some examples later about contextual analysis for proposals and whatever. You want to analyze current events and trends that could influence opinion. So this means you have to actually go out and do some research, right, for analyzing those, again, using Google Trends or Trends.Google, looking at current events, staying up what's going on. And again, that contextual analysis might be because it's going to affect the emotional or logical state of your audience, or it could just be you use it to get things across because they all know about that. If you assume they know something, then you can spend more of your text on messaging about what you want and less about trying to educate them about the general background. And this can be also useful to evaluate the technological context and platforms used by your audience, again, especially for web-based stuff or technological type messaging, understanding it. There's no point in talking about Instagram then maybe there is, but there's less point of talking about TikTok to an audience of retired folks than there is if you're aiming at teenagers and younger generation, where if you look at the utilization of TikTok, it's much higher for younger audiences. So where are they? And again, this relates back to, say, some of the demographics, but thinking about them from a contextual point of view. Address the economic factors like purchasing power, right? If your target audience doesn't have a lot of money, you might have to both talk to them in a different way, but you might have to tell a different story in terms of value instead of prestige. People who are affluent are far more likely to make prestige buys where it's about having something that is perceived to be expensive so they can show off that they have wealth, whereas somebody who is less economically situated wouldn't be buying things just for their purchasing power. Those who want to look like they have a lot of money might. So that there's a sort of range there. Who are you going after? You want to consider the cultural, social norms affecting your audience. So how you present stuff. If you want to focus, for example, on U.S. markets, talking about creativity and individuality is a good thing. If I'm writing for a Chinese audience, I would probably not want to focus on either of those as the core story or messaging that I'm trying to get across. And again, you go back and take all these contextuals and you put them into your persona model. And a different way of looking at building your persona model is after you've captured some things, you could go through this list of things and say, oh, what about the context? What can I add to my persona model and flush it out using this kind of data? So the demographic analysis and the personas, and by the way, these are not in importance order. These are in alphabetical order, so C, D. So you gather relevant demographic data you can, age, gender, location. Some of it you're going to have to estimate. Some of it you might actually be able to get from the audience themselves, depending on how you're gathering data. And often you want to segment your audience based on these demographic factors. What you really want to say, is there some natural grouping, as I just gave the example with TikTok, between age, right? Or in terms of context, in terms of stuff, in terms of like China versus the US. You're going to segment your audience based on some of this and think about how big is the audience for each of those pieces. You're going to develop personas that represent each of the segments. Make sure that each of the major segments has somebody in it. And this part of this is hard when you're, for example, pitching your business. You got to think about how big are these things. Some of the videos that you can look at, there's data on specialized tools to help you estimate demographic size and content. Almost all countries and all the states in the U.S. have ways of estimating some of those things for different regions. You want to use his personas in crafting your messaging, and you notice it's messages. It's plural because different demographic segments might need different messages. I might still be able to sell the same exact idea to two different groups, but I might need different messages to reach them. And the nice thing is if they actually manage different channels, so I might have one story that shows up in AARP for retired folks and a different messaging that I put out on TikTok. And I don't have to worry about a person being confused because they see two different messages, because it's less likely that the same person is going to see them both. Ideally, when you go through demographic analysis, I actually think this is a good place to start. You make hypotheses. Oh, again, this is the kind of thing we're talking about in entrepreneurship. You make hypotheses about this persona, and then you go out and do real-world testing. You do customer interviews. You go back to the interview analysis, and then you figure out both where you're right and where you're wrong. And then you revise your personas based on these observed interactions. And so this is, even though it's in the middle of where I'm presenting, this is often where one might start, where you think about what's going on, who do I want to reach, how big are they, what are the messages, build a persona, and then you go out and try and validate this. Besides interview analysis, another kind of directly using customers is what's called feedback analysis. So if I have existing content and interaction, so if I'm an organization that has ongoing things, I collect the feedback from those contacts and interactions. And that might be using the comment sections, reviews, direct user feedback. Many companies actually have an incentive for you to give them feedback after you bought the product, either publicly, like on Amazon, or through written survey cards. I've actually had, like last time when I bought a brand new car, the dealer was in Texas, but they still called me to ask about my experience in the process, right? But also like how I found them and what the messaging was. So that's a pretty common thing. You want to follow up with any customers and get data you can. And then you can use that to refine your messaging strategy based on the feedback. And ideally, if you get enough of this, you want to use tools and analytics to track those changes over time, creating an improvement loop using the feedback. So you get the feedback, you make some changes, and you iterate through this loop. And if you set this up and you have a process that allows you to easily collect feedback, then you can do this over and over again and have monthly improvements to your messaging to keep them on target. The bigger players on Amazon, one of my students actually for a while was in top 10 companies on Amazon for a bunch of categories. They did this, he got his PhD in machine learning, right? And his focus was on using analytics. And so he was helping the company to analyze the data, to look at the reviews, to look at the feedback, and figure out how to change how they message. What is the posting of their product on Amazon? And then use the data to optimize what that messaging is to improve their performance, and it works reasonably well. Lots of companies use this sort of feedback loop as a way of analyzing their audience and refining it. Okay, another technique that's widely used, again, common in entrepreneurship in the beginning, but also commonly used in larger organizations, is observation participation, sometimes called ethnography. And the reason to do this is that people often, even in interviews, answer in ways that are not actually consistent with what they do. So ideally, you want to observe the audience behavior in some natural setting. So if I go into a store and I watch in the aisle where my product might be placed, the behavior of shoppers, then I can learn a lot about how those people behave. And I can analyze what's making them drive decisions, what are they doing. I can estimate during that process their demographics. I can estimate age, maybe something about from the way they're dressed, at least what they appear to be willing to spend for things. And you take notes on their language, their concerns, their interactions. All of those are things you can do. Oddly enough, you can even do this as an academic, looking at science, because I can look at what's going on at a conference and look at what rooms are very full. This is a kind of very bulk analysis of what's interesting. But I can also look how people approach different topics and analyze that. So you can look for this for actionable insights to enhance your persona of what's going on about how people make decisions, how they behave, right? Again, some of the key questions, right? And then ideally, again, we're going to cross-reference these observations with existing personas or surveys, right? This is one way of gathering data. If you want to build a really good model of people, you want to gather multiple sources of data and put them all together. Another one, which is very common today, which is related to both the feedback model and to some of the context analysis, is social media analysis. So I can monitor key social media channels for mentions, tags, comments. I can look to see who's talking about us, but not necessarily talking to us. And that's really the difference between the traditional feedback model. These are not necessarily customers who are reaching out to us to talk. These are customers that are saying things about us. They may not even be customers. They may be people who hate us and will never be our customer. We want to understand where they are and what's going on. And again, social media is the kind of thing that lends itself to large-scale digital analytics to evaluate the sentiment, their word usage, their knowledge. What do they know? How do they talk about us? What words are they using? And that's part of the sentiment. So I can get high-level things, but I can also get how I might use some of the phrases they use in my marketing, if they're saying positive things, or even if they're saying negative things, to sort of counteract what's going on and understand what's going on. Obviously, in terms of like understanding trends and whatever, you can do trending topics and hashtags relevant to your audience. Understand how that's changing and adapt your messaging strategies based on these trends. Even in science, these things can be useful because the same idea might be described 5 or 6 different ways, but understanding which of those ways of describing the same topic end up with the highest trending categories, or most used, means that's the way the largest part of your audience is talking about them, and maybe that's the strategy you should be able to adopt. And it's even a couple of word difference in phrasing can make the difference between people finding what you're doing understandable and relatable and them pushing it away because they don't understand it. And then you want to compare your social media performance with competitors. So again, it doesn't have to be just you. Coming back to the competitor analysis, this is another way you can analyze competitors. You can look at the social media feeds for them and then analyze their audience and the difference between their audience and your intended audience for clues about how you might want to be putting stuff together. I have one that's out of order. This idea is user testing. This is often used when you have, especially for website communication or media communication, where I will have a focus group, or I will have a small set of testers. And ideally, I develop a specific set of criteria and benchmarks and tasks for user testing. In a smart sense, I do all of this before I do any of the testing. I develop what I want to measure, how I'm going to measure it, over what data, some set of data, and then I select a diverse segment of your audience, different people from different of the demographic segments that I expect to have, and I evaluate how the audience interacts with your content. And whatever that content is, I evaluate it, and I get feedback, and again, I can both observe them, so I can watch for facial expressions, I can listen to them and hear how noisy they are, I can see how fidgety they are, but I can also, after I've done this, have a particular feedback mechanism. So this might include an audience interview. Focus groups have a little bit of this, but very often people do this where they first give the audience the material, and then, so this is the difference, user testing, you give them something, and then you get their feedback, and then you iterate. Even my survey had a little bit of this, because I actually gave you 2 chapters of the book to get with slightly different styles between them, to sort of see what would matter to you, so that you could actually give me feedback based on something that's not abstract, but something that's concrete. You could look at it and say, oh yeah, this is what I like, this is what I didn't like. You didn't have to struggle with what did he mean by setting a chapter objective. You could see the one I had. Again, you're going to record results, compare against your predefined benchmarks. In this case, if I start with a smart objective and I want to improve audience's positive sentiment comments by 15%, I can take my audience and I can show some fraction of my old message, some of my new message, and measure the difference. That's a perfect way of getting a nice solid experiment that measures the difference between things. And then I'm going to refine the content strategy best in the testing. So I've saved this one for last because I'm actually going to spend a lot more time on it. It's called psychographic analysis. And basically, I want to look at psychographic factors like lifestyle, values, opinions, and create psychographic segments based on this analysis. There's many ways of doing this. I'm going to talk about one that I have found useful in the next couple of slides. But now I tail messages aligned with each of those psychographic segments. And if you think about it, if I have demographic segments and behavioral segments and psychographic segments, the intersection could quickly blow up to lots of things. So normally people choose 1 or 2 of those segmentations and use them. Because if I have 4 different demographics and 16 psychographic segments and 5 different behavioral segments, the product of that is a couple hundred. I can't afford it. For smaller things, you can't afford that. Large companies like Procter & Gamble, they can actually do all of that, and they sometimes do. But in terms of the messaging here, after you think about messages for particular people, again, you want to go back and test the effectiveness for these tailored specific messages. So like some of the others, if I can do this before I do any interviews or before I do any surveys, and I can somehow estimate which psychographic group the interviewee or the survey recipient is in, now I can say I made messages, I'm going to go do the user testing and figure out how it affects different messages. And one of the reasons this can be important for psychographically tailored messages is when I take the bulk data, the same message might make a conservative audience member move one way while it makes a progressive audience member move another. That's a psychographic segmentation, maybe a behavior, but that's going to make them behave differently. So you want to think of messages tailored, and you can't just look what's the average, because now it depends on how you sample. And again, data analytics to monitor segment-specific engagement for doing large-scale tactical writing, understanding what's going on. And this might sound like something I only do for large scale, but I'm going to talk about how I use it for both writing papers, but more importantly for writing proposals, because this is something I've used for a long time. So I'm going to talk about one particular subset of psychographic. As I just gave you an example of large-scale things like conservative versus progressive styles, right? That's an overall mentality. But I'm going to talk about something called the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, MBTI. It's widely used in industry. I think the MBTI Corporation has 75 of the Fortune 100 companies that are customers and work with them. I will start off by saying that I understand, I've also done psychology work, that this is not the best model. Let's not say it's not good. It's not the best model for many people for predicting actual psychology, but I have found it more useful than, say, the big five for being able to make predictions about how I want to write and how my audience will behave. And so the MBTI has 16 personality types based on 4 dichotomous pairs. How much is the person extroverted versus introverted? Are they sensing versus intuitive? Are they thinking versus feeling? Thinking versus feeling, and judging versus perception. And if you understand these personality types, you can tell your writings to resonate more effectively with your audience. And you'll see why I think this actually works pretty well for estimating your audience. I will also make the comment that MBTI folks, in the original theory, excuse me, MBTI folks call it a type, in that it's like this is the way you are. I actually don't care whether or not it's a type. I don't actually believe it is. There are times when I definitely change my appearance of what type I'm acting in. And I think actually when I was young, I was absolutely introverted. I grew up on a farm. I didn't interact with lots of people. And I was petrified to be on stage. I could not work with people. In a crowd, I just wanted to go hide in the corner and not deal with people. As I've had to act extroverted to be my job, I have learned to actually go into many large situations and get energy from interacting with people, which is, again, one of the ways people think about it, right? So do I focus on the inner world or the external world? Well, it depends on what my objectives are. Do I get energy from being quiet and alone? Yes. I can get energy from being quiet alone. Do I get energy from the external world? Yes, it depends on where I am and what I'm trying to accomplish. And so I could be either of those. And when I test with MBTI, I tend to now test more extroverted, and when I was in high school, I tested more introverted. So can I change? I think I have. I've evolved. It's actually, for the things we're going to talk about for understanding your audience, unless you're talking about writing for speeches or personal interactions, it's actually the least important dimension. It doesn't matter as much how they view those things, but the other 3 dimensions I think will be important. There can still be a little bit of the external world if you're focusing on external things versus if you're trying to sell people self-meditation and they're extroverted, it may not focus on them. So it might still be an important dimension depending on what your objective is. The next dimension is, do they prefer concrete information or abstract theories or intuitive decision-making processes? Are they making decisions based on logic or values and feelings? That's thinking versus feeling. And then do they prefer to, it's called judging versus perceiving, but I think the easier way to look at it is, do they prefer organization and decisiveness versus flexibility and spontaneity, right? So these are the kinds of questions for estimating the types. And so this slide's a little bit of an eye chart here. Are the 16 types, and so you answer questions, and for your homework this week, I'm going to actually ask you to all go out and just do one of these, and I'm going to ask you to estimate it for other people based on what you've seen in the discussions, and then we're going to have a post, and people will sort of get into discussion of what you think and why. So, in terms of, are you outwardly or inwardly focused, right? So there's a bunch of questions here you might ask yourself. I'm not going to read through all these. There's way too many words on the slide for that. But this slide deck will be something you might look at. And again, it's also in the text. But are you described as outgoing? Do you want to be in a face-painted environment? Do you tend to work out ideas with others and think out loud? Then you're extrovert. Or are you a private person, prefer a slower pace, trying to think inside your own head? Then you're more of an introvert. And so you can sort of see why that might matter, because people who are extroverted are more likely to work with others on their ideas. So if I'm writing for them, I want things that they can easily share with other people and get feedback on. But how do they take in information? So if they're sensing, they prefer the reality of things are. They pay attention to concrete facts and details. They prefer ideas that have practical applications. And they like to describe things in a very specific, literal way. Then you're probably more of a sensing person. But if you like to imagine the possibilities of how things could be, if you notice the big picture and how everything connects, or you enjoy ideas and concepts for their own sake, describe things in a more figurative, poetic way, then you're intuitive. And you can sort of see the style of writing that those two different types might enjoy or might resonate with are quite different. So when I'm writing, it might help for me to be able to estimate which of those matter to my audience. And again, your audience doesn't have to be one person, so you can have some of each. How do they make decisions? This is often critical for tactical writing, because you want to understand how they make decisions, because you want them to make decisions. That's part of your objective. So are they making them in a personal way using logic and reasoning? Do they value justice and fairness? Do they find enjoyment in finding enjoyment in the flaws of argument? It means they're going to look for any flaw they can find in yours. Those kind of people are T's, thinking. But if they base their decisions on personal values and your actions affect others, if they value harmony, forgiveness, equity, if they like to please others and point out the best in people, they're kind of people that will ignore the flaws and find the good things in what you're doing, then they're a feeling type. And again, those two dimensions are going to drastically change how you might write to different people. Are you focusing on justice and logic, or are you talking about feelings? I actually find that dimension the easiest to remember, right? Thinking versus feeling, because the feeling has got a lot of feelings in it. And then how do you prefer outside your life? To me, this is also a way of how people make decisions, but they're making decisions about other things. So people who are judging tend to have matters settled. I think rules and deadlines should be respected. They prefer to have detailed step-by-step instructions, and they make plans to get things done. Whereas perceiving people tend to leave your options open, see rules and deadlines as flexible, like to improvise and make things up as you go, and are spontaneously enjoy surprises and new situations. So based on those descriptions, we can now talk about how you might estimate people's things, right? Are they energized more by people? Do they seem to talk or focus on internal things? Listen to what they talk about. Are there a lot of facts and details, or theories and possibilities? How do they make decisions? Logic and objectivity, or are they values and emotions? And their lifestyle, are they planned and orderly? Are they spontaneous and flexible? So just for a second, I'd like you to think, given what you've seen in the book and in my video so far, what would you think I am? Right? Am I a different type? So now I'm going to get to some frequencies, right? So the table on the bottom right here shows frequency of things. So which of these am I? I already told you I'm leaning to an E, so you can put yourself in the bottom half of the table. Am I an ESTP, an ESFJ, right? So am I making decisions in different ways, right? So I'll tell you that I test now relatively consistently as an ENTP. Every now and then I'm an INTP, but almost always I'm an ENTP. It depends on the questions that the test asks, and maybe also what's happened in the last couple of weeks. So I'm going to go through, again, the left-hand side of this, a little bit of eye chart. We're going to go through it. But I'm going to go back and mention that the 16 types are also sometimes broken down based on these colors here into what are called the four temperaments. There's actually two different uses of the word four temperaments, but these are the four temperaments. And this breakdown of personalities and how people interact goes way back to the Greeks. And so we'll talk about people who are rational, NTs. They have an intellectual strategy. They prioritize intellect, logic, problem solving, aim for innovation and mastery. I'm an NT. And you can sort of see NTs are actually not that common, right? We have 3.2, 1.8, 3.3, 2.1. So if you're writing in a style that is using logic, that is dominated by logic, you're looking at a much smaller fraction of the population than if I'm looking at something that is going for the Guardians, SJ. SJ is actually the largest subgroup. Here's 11, here's 13, SJ, here's 8, here's 12, right? So like 40-some% of the population are SJs. These are practical, responsible individuals who value stability, tradition, order in their lives, right? If you're writing for the average audience, there's going to be a lot more of them than there are the rationalists. So one of the things I want, and one of the reasons I'm going to have you do the assignment this week where you look at stuff, is because I want you to understand that wherever you are in this chart, there's the majority of people are not like you. And so when you're writing, you have to think about how other people view things and how they're going to react to what you're writing, and not just write from the way you think will work for you, because that's almost always a small part of the population. And for people like me, it's a really small part of the population. So on the left here, we're actually going to go through this in more detail. I just want to have that big chart so you can sort of see how they're not, there's a combination of intuitive types, but then the sensing types are broken up based on whether or not they're introverts or extroverts in terms of how it works for the temperaments. So the first four categories, again, there's a bunch of words here that describe these people. I'm just going to choose a couple, right? But so for somebody who's an ISTJ, again, a very popular category, they're focused, diligent, practical, logical, responsible. They tend to be in charge, resilient. You will actually see lots of these types of people in management, which is a little bit surprising because people think of managers as not being being extroverts. Some managers are, but lots of them are actually ISTJs. ISFJs are friendly, responsible. They tend to add stability to groups. They work through. They're loyal. They're empathetic. These people can also make good managers, but very often they are more in roles where they are helping other people, and they don't feel managing people in the same way. INFJ, they're persistent, they're original, they adapt. They're quietly deterministic and can be relatively empathetic. They really like to lead in serving the common good. So this is another group of people for which social things and leading in social efforts is good. It's something they enjoy. INTJs, possess original minds. They value creativity. They're skeptical. They're determined. They're actually occasionally stubborn, sometimes very stubborn. And they compromise to a lesser matter to secure a greater victory. So they're going to make that trade-off. ISTPs, calm observers, quiet, detached, interested in cause and effect, some logical organizations of facts. ISFPs, the reserved, kind, modest, avoid conflicts, prefer to follow and be loyal as opposed to trying to lead, more like INFJs. INFPs are, again, they're loyal, they share opportunities with familiarity, they value learning, ideas, and independent projects. They're less focused on possessions and surroundings, they're more focused on actually people. INTPs are reserved, drawn to theories and scientific things, problem solving, logic, interested in ideas, less in socializing. So these are your classic scientific nerd type people will often be in this category. Extroverts for sensing, we have ESTPs. They're spontaneous problem solving, and put them in a plastic bag, they'll find a way out. They embrace problem solving without worries. They are interested in mechanics, sports, socializing. They prefer practical skills, but overall, they have a broad range of things they're interested in. ESFPs can be outgoing, enthusiastic, active in sports and events, eager participants. They recall facts well. They're practical, people-oriented, so in terms of what they do with people, they thrive in diverse situations. Extrovert for ENFP, they're enthusiastic, imaginative. They rely on improvisation over preparation, so they tend to wing it a lot. Skillful at persuasion and finding solutions. They will actually change their arguments very regularly in the middle of a conversation because they'll see, I'm trying to persuade you, it's not working, I'll change over. ENTP, they're innovative, versatile, outspoken, often argumentative. They thrive on tackling novel challenges but may overlook routine tasks. They're often proficient at justifying their preference, so they can explain why they're making these choices. Other people make choices and can't always figure out why or explain why. ESTJs, the last row, These are practical, business-minded, adept at mechanics, focus on useful subjects, adapt when needed. They enjoy potential, organization leading, potential for effective communication. This type is also commonly found within management. ESFJs are warm, talkative, cooperative, conscientious, skilled in teamwork and committees, fostering things. They flourish with encouragement. They really need feedback. Some people like INTPs, feedback doesn't really make a big difference to them, although some of them are a little more sensitive. ENFJs are responsible, considerate. They're attuned to others' feelings and thoughts. They're skilled in presenting ideas and leading discussions. They're sociable, well liked in general. They're open to feedback and praise, so that they do well if you help them, give them feedback and figure out what's going on. ENTJ, hearty, candid, decisive, intelligent, reasoning, communications, public speaking. They often enjoy public speaking. They're informed and curious leaders. Informed and curious learners. They actually do make pretty good curious leaders too. They sometimes exude more confidence than their experience suggests, so they tend to be a little bit more have a little bit more bluffery going on. But at the bottom in the columns here, I forgot when I showed the big table. These are other verbs used to describe everyone in the column, sort of directing, relating, valuing, envisioning. All of that goes with everyone in each of those columns. So looking at some of the statistics, I already showed you a little bit in terms of some things, but this is just another way of looking at the statistics. Visually, this might give you a much bigger feel for, if I look at the IST, ISFJs, ESFJs, ISTJs, and ISFJs, we get, like, in 5 types, we get half the people. So the rest of the 11 are much smaller and smaller fractions. The largest temperament, which I said is around 40, is SJ, which again are the guardians. The SP are the artisans. They're around 30%. They're spontaneous, adaptable, enjoy hands-on experiences. NTs are the smallest, the rationals. And then the idealists, which are compassionate, manageable individuals driven by a strong sense of purpose. They're around 14. So just looking at this demographic breakdown, if you start thinking about how I would be writing, if I know nothing about my audience, I might actually aim for writing that sort of addresses these 2 subtypes of temperaments, because those 2 temperaments cover 70% of the people. On the other hand, if I'm writing a proposal to a bunch of scientists, because I know from some of the other data, you can look up data for individual fields, there's a lot more of the NT and NF, depending on which type of proposal I'm writing, that will be in those organizations. So who's my audience? If I can analyze it, and sometimes I will go back and try and analyze what they have written in the past to estimate their type. So if I go back and look at some of those characteristics and ask, how is this paragraph written? Is it written about feelings, or is it written about logic and data for making thinking, right? Is it about spontaneous, or is it super well structured? And what's interesting is that in organizations, you will often see things where one subtype will dominate. So you have to be a little careful. So if you look at a call for proposals and it's very detailed about organization, then you can be pretty sure that there's a J in that organization that helped write that proposal. Because other people, if they were P, they'd probably be flexible and leave it lots of opportunities. This is how I make lots of decisions about what I'm trying to write, because I analyze it and say, okay, and then in my head I have persona. I have different people who are TJs. So I've had many colleagues that were ISTJs, and so I can just instantly map to them, or INTJs, right? It's like, oh, this is like Greg. I'm going to write this as though I was talking to Greg, make the arguments for Greg, right? At least for part of it in terms of the way I'm going to approach things, because they're going to want to have lots of data and things well structured and organized. They will kill me if I misspell a word. The FPs, if I talk about feelings and there's a misspelled word, they may not notice at all. Different types will go on. So this can be useful. Understanding where you are is a little bit useful, but mostly so that you understand when things fall on you, when you receive a message from your boss, you need to understand how it's going to hit you and what's going to go on with that. And there's plenty of more this stuff on the web. Again, don't view this as how you are. Don't view this as stereotyping people. View it as how people seem to behave. And if that's how they behave, it doesn't matter what they really have inside at one level, because you're just basing on their thing. So as I said, for proposals, coming back to context analysis, I use MBTI type analysis, but I also do a lot of contextual analysis. So I have to understand the expectations and evaluation criteria, understanding exactly what they're asking and why. I want to cater to the stated goals of the proposal recipient, because again, the funder always has to have a win. If I'm writing a proposal, I have to do what they are. I want to look at the broader societal and industrial context, including potential competing proposals. When I tell my story, I have to differentiate it from the other stories they might be hearing if I want to win this. Going back to the standard stuff for loop, right? I want to ensure the proposal lines with the proposal call or the RFP and requirements, right? If there are requirements, I want to make sure they're documented. So part of my context analysis is making sure I write down a checklist of these are the things that have to happen. If possible, and there are lots of opportunities for different grants where I can talk with other authors on the process, or anyone on my team, obviously I can always talk to. But I might talk to people who have been involved in the submitted proposals before. In many organizations, you can get example reviews of past proposals or example proposals and find out how they did. All of that can be useful for understanding how was the messaging used and how was it received. Think of this as collecting some of the data, contextual analysis. But understanding what's going on in society and industry is part of the analysis so that I can relate to what's going on. So beyond understanding the personality types of the people I'm writing to for a proposal, I want to understand all of this context that goes well. If I'm writing a contextual analysis for a technical paper, I have to make sure I'm sending to the right audience, right? So I actually have a choice where I send my papers when I go to publish them. So I first compare with published ones, and I have my students do this all the time. Go read the papers in the place you want to submit to. Do you sound like them, or you're writing like them? That's part of understanding what that audience's style is going to look like, and also how they present stuff. Is it a lot of data, or is it a lot of discussion? It could be both. Depends on what the journal or conference is. Understanding the publication criteria and expectations, instructions. So again, part of the context is what do you have to do to meet all the rules? Because if there's somebody there who's a rule person, right, they're going to be a TJ and they're going to say, no, you got to follow all these rules. Then you want to make sure you follow all of them, because you will get things returned for missing just one rule. Ensure your research is original, significant, broadly relevant, credible, well justified. Again, different audience members, but most of the audiences when you're looking at scientific papers are going to be looking for that TJ if I'm looking at science, which is where I publish. In the field of psychology, they're looking for stories that relate well. But sometimes in the field of education, my sister was in special education, there it's far more about feelings and passion and emotion than about having the logic well structured, because the reviewers for her work were on the social side that were far more likely to be on the sort of FP side, and they were more about the stories and things going on. And we'll spend a lot of time later in the book about stories, and we'll talk about different stories for different personality types. You want to consider the broader scientific and societal context. For example, in the machine learning area, it's become common to have to talk about power utilization or bias in what's going on. And if you don't talk about that, there'll be some reviewers that will just toast you. So you want to think about that. And then finally, I like to discuss with other authors on the paper and the process, right? But also example reviews of past papers. So many websites have reviews of past papers, so you can sort of see what's going on as they try and get out the word for what this is going to look like. So just some examples of how I've used those for my own work. So what are you going to do with all this? So you've done all this research. You're going to do possibly multiple subsets. You might start with demographic, then design a survey. Based on the survey, you might then go back and do some feedback analysis, whatever. So when you can't get much direct feedback from the audience, you're going to start with those few persona you can get, either from MBTI analysis or just demographics. You're going to make your best guess. And ideally, you're going to use that with some research to fill in more data. But in the beginning, you might also just fill it in with people you know. As I said, I'll write things as though I'm writing to particular individuals. Like I'm writing for Walter or to Nancy or to Greg, because they're different personality types, and I know how those different personalities might react when I say something, because I've talked with them a lot. So I know how that works. And then when you're going to write your story and your text, you're going to review it from each persona's point of view. Again, this idea of a checklist. If I have 5 personas that I think are my audience, or 10, then I'm going to want to go back and I'm going to think, okay, have I written it so that that person will get it? And I'll analyze what I'm doing, and also I'll analyze my story before I do all the writing, and then I'll do it again when I'm doing the writing. And ideally, if you're in a large enough organization where you can get it, the personas you want on your red team are supposed to try and match at least one person for each persona you expect to be on the review team. And when I was in my company, we did some very large proposals with companies like $100 million proposals. The company used MBTI to help match different proposal personas to the red team for the review. So they look at technical expertise, business expertise, but then they also look at personality types to pull people from their organization. They have thousands, tens of thousands of employees to put together to make sure, because when you've got $100 million on the line, you don't want to leave anything to chance. You want to put it all together and make sure it works. So ending with the final quote, a man really writes for an audience of about 10 persons. And the reason I really like this quote is because even if I'm writing for thousands, I will probably end up with a small number, like 5 to 10 personas that I'm really writing for. And I really hope everyone else will like it. But if I can really aim for them, that's what I'm aiming for. If I'm writing for reviewers for a proposal, 10 is probably larger or about the size of the team, so I'm writing just for them. As a scientist, very often the reviewer cycles are 3 or 4, so it's even smaller. But anyhow, that's audience analysis. Understanding your audience was going to be a critical part when we get into storytelling in the future chapters. So this gives you some background and some tools to use to put this together.